Aaron Vale woke before the sun. He woke to the sound of the sky breaking. It was not a sound he had heard before, a long, low keening, like metal crying, and then a hard, bright strike that lit the clouds. He sat up on the roof of the ruined hospital and watched a shape fall out of the dark. It hit the river and steamed like a living thing. Down below, people shouted and ran. Somewhere a dog howled until it could not hear itself. For 3 days a great fleet had hung in the sky. It had been a quiet thread at first, a ring of ships that pulsed like a heartbeat. Then the Dominion spoke through their loudspeakers, and their thin, cold messages: surrender, serve, be useful, or be scrap. The voice made promises that felt like commands. People argued, cried, and tried to make sense of how the world had changed in a single breath. Aaron had one answer. It was not surrender. It was a single, stubborn thing called survival. He put on his jacket, found the radio that still worked, and climbed down into the streets. The city smelled of wet ash and old bread. Broken glass glittered like stars on the pavement. Aaron walked with a small group of people who moved like they had learned to watch the sky and the ground at the same time. They spoke in low voices, because loud voices grew into beacons. They shared small facts that mattered. A woman named Layla taught how to make a bandage from a torn shirt and a little clean water. An old man Jor kept a list of places where rainwater gathered and did not taste wrong. A boy, Sam, could find a place where the Dominion's sensors slept because the light there bent in a strange way. These things were not heroic. They were simple. But simple things save lives. At night, around a fire in an empty theater, Aaron listened to stories on the radio. He heard the voice of a stranger who called himself Patch and who said, "Live where they do not look." The words were quiet in the static. They planted like a seed. The next day Aaron found an old map hidden under a shelf in the library. On the map someone had written the same line, "Live where they do not look." The idea was plain and dangerous. If the Dominion scanned the obvious places, then people must go where the scans could not reach, or would not bother to search. They must turn scarcity into a tool. They would make every need a lesson for the enemy. They would make hiding into a trap. That was the plan. It was small and made of small things. Fake fires, false footprints, broken radios that still hummed. It asked for patience and for a kind of cruelty that saved people instead of taking them. Aaron gathered people who did not want to be saved by a radio voice. He found Mara, a teacher who kept her voice for telling children stories. Mara believed a story could teach a machine to be wrong. She taught how to twist an old kettle into a decoy that smelled like cooking bread. She taught how to make a camp look full by leaving toys and a kettle on a low fire, while the real camp slept under a collapsed bridge. They learned to set traps that were not meant to kill. They meant to confuse and delay. A throne mirror might reflect a drone's beam and make it search the wrong corner. A hidden weight could tip a supply cart and strand a patrol for hours. Their first practice came on a narrow street where a supply route ran. The Dominion liked to send small patrols through places that looked empty. Aaron's group set a row of old crates on the side. Inside the crates they left jars of water, a lantern, and some bread, all the marks of a camp. Then they dug a shallow pit under a loose wooden plank and covered it with dirt and leaves. When a patrol came, a scout saw the lantern first. He signaled. The patrol moved in to take the food. The wooden plank gave under heavy boots. The patrol found its vehicle keys gone, and one of its support cables wrapped in old wire that shorted when wet. The machine stalled in the mud. The patrol left with a shaken silence. It was not a victory of guns. It was a small victory of thought. Word moved through the ruins like wind. People began to believe in the map's idea. They learned that a broken place could be made to look whole, and that a whole place could be made to look broken. The Dominion adjusted. They sent back smarter probes. Their machines began to look for patterns that humans could not see. Heartbeat, heat, the way a camp breathed in and out. The new probes would not be fooled by a fake kettle or a mirror. One night, after a rain that made the streets shine like dark glass, a probe dropped into the rivered part of the city. It did not float. It sank and sent out a sound that meant nothing to a human ear but everything to a machine. It scanned, and it learned. From the rooftop, Aaron heard the machines whine and felt the small, hard beat of fear in his chest. He thought of the map, and of Mara's lessons, and of the boy Sam who found sleeping sensors. Each little trick had value, but the Dominion's machines were learning faster than a single human mind. Aaron stood on the roof and watched the steam rise from the river. The city around him was full of people who had learned to hide, to mend, to share. It was also full of people who would not accept death as a simple act. The map's words burned in his hand like an idea you could not unlearn. "Live where they do not look," he whispered. He could feel the plan growing in the crowd below. It would need more than lanterns and planks. It would need stubbornness and more hands. Below, a young woman laughed in a way that sounded like a knife. She held a scrap of metal up to the light and sang it, as if the song would keep the fear away. Aaron smiled, despite the danger. He understood then what the map had promised. Survival could be more than hiding. It could be the first strike. He folded the map into his jacket and went down to teach the city how to make hiding into a weapon. The traps began as small things. They were not clever machines. They were ideas made with hands that knew how to mend a boot or boil a pot. Aaron and Mara taught the lessons by the fire. People came with small gifts, a length of wire, a cracked mirror, a tin can. They listened and learned. The city learned to look like itself and to hide what mattered behind a curtain of noise. Mara showed them how to make a camp that smelled like bread. She took an empty kettle, filled it with cold stones and wet cloths, and put it over a low, fake flame. The kettle steamed and smelled like cooking. A walking drone would see the steam, mark the heat, and send a scout to check. The scout would find bread left on a plate and a small toy on the ground, the marks of a family. The scout would report back, empty. The patrol would come. Then the trick worked. The patrol would be slowed by a trap that used no bullets. A plank might give, dropping a heavy wheel into mud. A short wire would tangle a machine's sensor and force it to stop and wait for repairs. They practiced on a supply street where carts moved at night. One team dug under the cobbles and put a light board that would bend and make a small gap. They used old cloths to make footprints that led away from the gap. When a patrol came, it followed the prints and walked past the real hiding place. The patrol left with dry mouths and fewer supplies. These were not great victories. They were small wins that cost nothing but a headache and a slow night. But small wins add up. The Dominion found itself asking why its patrols stalled. Their reports came back with one word: doubt. Doubt was new. Machines did not feel doubt, but their commanders could not stop thinking about it. The trap makers did, more than fool sensors. They learned to use the city's shape. Sam, who could find sleeping sensors, led them into the sewers. They turned wet pipes into false drains. A patrol that walked over a pipe heard a sound that meant nothing to them, but meant everything to a machine. The echo of movement in a tunnel. The patrol spent hours searching under the road. By the time they left, the trapmakers had taken their keys. A hydro plant outside the city became another classroom. The plant had a gate and a concrete yard. It had power lines and a lone guard post. The trapmakers turned the guard post into a stage. They put out a pile of old tools and a half-cooked lunch. They left a note in a strange hand. A patrol arrived to check. The trap was not violent. It was patient. The patrol's vehicle stalled on a patch of old oil that the trapmakers had placed hours before. The vehicle slipped into a shallow ditch. It did not burn or explode. It simply could not move. The patrol was cut off from support for long hours. Time, the trapmakers learned, was often more valuable than a bullet. Word of the tricks moved fast. Groups from other parts of the city came to learn. Teachers, bakers, and children joined. They used toys, mirrors, and kettles. They learned to make fires that smelled like living. They learned to leave radios that hummed on old channels. They left messes that looked real but hid silence beneath them. The Dominion reacted. It began to change the way it looked for humans. New probes came that could sense a heartbeat. They used light and heat and a thin, clever math to find life behind blankets. The machines looked not for fire, but for the slow rise and fall of a chest. A fake kettle would not fool them now. The trapmakers watched this change and felt a chill. The new probes made a mistake for them if they did not change. Mara's lessons turned sharper. She taught how to hide a heartbeat. They learned to breathe as one. A dozen people would practice slow, measured breaths until they matched the wind. They learned to make decoy heartbeats. A child named Ela had a small, hollow drum. Ela and a friend set the drum to beat at the pace of a human chest. They put it inside a crate near a fake camp. When a probe came, it registered the drum as a pulse. The patrol moved in. It moved into a place where the trapmakers waited with nothing dangerous, only with the patience to watch. The patrol found nothing but a broken toy and a kettle that had never boiled. It left confused. The trapmakers laughed in low voices. The drum worked. It gave the patrol a false story and bought time. The laughter did not last long. Machines learned fast. A probe scanned the drum and marked it as odd. It began to look for matches, other signals that did not match the small changes of a living body. The Dominion updated its rules. The probes started to test the rhythm, to look for tiny breathing shifts, for anger and tears, and the soft heating of skin. The traps that worked before now failed more often. Still, the trapmakers kept trying. They found ways to hide life inside things the machines did not trust. A wet sack placed against a wall could hide heat. A mirror could change an angle of light, so a probe could not see a chest. The trapmakers learned to move like a tide. They became better at being false and then being true. Then something strange happened. The small drum that Ela had used began to answer back. It was not an answer the child expected. In the night, after the training, the drum beat on its own. At first it was soft. Then it was a steady pattern, not a human rhythm, but close enough to draw attention. The radio, set to a quiet band, picked up a voice that said nothing at first, only long, slow tones. The voice sounded like a place the trapmakers had heard in old stories, a place of people who had left the city long ago. Aaron heard the tone and felt a new kind of cold. The drum's beat matched the radio tone. It was a signal. It was not the Dominion. It was not human in the way they knew. It was a beacon, old and lonely. Someone, somewhere, had answered their fake heartbeat with a real one. The trapmakers fell silent. The work that had been simple and small now reached out like a hand into the dark. The drum had called a name. The city waited to learn who would answer. The city taught them to hide. The land taught them to hurt without a gun. After the drum answered, in the dark, Aaron and the trapmakers looked beyond the streets. Sam drew a map with a stick on wet earth. He pointed to a marsh 2 miles from the broken rail yard. The marsh was full of reeds and thin water. The Dominion called places like that useless. People who did not know the land walked past and sank. That made the marsh perfect. They traveled in small groups. They walked like ghosts, so the air would not change too much. Mara watched how the ground gave under boots. She listened to frogs and the small notes of insects. Where a machine would see flat mud, she saw layers, soft peat near the reeds, harder clay under an old road, a pocket of quicksand near a willow. A farmer who had learned to read soil taught them how to dig without making a sound. The land had secrets, and she knew how to find them. The first work was patient. They dug small channels and filled them with cut reeds and old wire. To a passing Drone the channels looked like ordinary water lines. To a heavy machine, they were traps. The wires did not have to break a hole. They only needed to tangle a wheel or foul a pump. A support vehicle that could not move was a line cut from its center. Machines could not call for help across marshes where antennas sank. Aaron's people changed crops too. They planted thin rows of a bitter reed near the edges of paths. The reed left a fine dust on any wheel or lens that passed it. For a drone, the dust was like fog. For an optical sensor, it was like a smear on a lens. They learned to grind clay into a paste and smear it on leaves. The paste did not harm a human, but it made infrared eyes see wrong shapes. A field that looked golden in daylight would hide a patch that ate a machine's sight. The trap makers turned small farms into lessons. They left a path of fresh footprints to lure patrols. The footprints led over a ridge of pressed earth. Beneath that ridge was a shallow bed of mud that would open under metal weight. When a support vehicle crossed, the wheels found wet peat and could not get a grip. The vehicle dug itself deeper, trying to leave. The patrol had to stay until the sun went down and help arrived. Time became the human weapon again. The first large test came when a Dominion column tried to cut across the marsh to reach a supply depot. The machines moved in neat lines. They were heavy and loud, and the sound of them made birds fall silent. Aaron's group watched from a line of reeds. They had tied long ropes to hidden posts and placed stones where the water looked steady. The machines moved across, and the ropes pulled. A wheel slipped, then another. The column slowed and slid. Engines spun in the mud like animals. The marsh took their weight. It was not a killing. The machines did not explode. They sank, and they stalled. The column lost hours. The human scouts moved in with nothing more than a crowbar and patience. They took a few small parts and left ribbons of soaked cloth to mark where the machines had stopped. The Dominion would have to repair or move, and every repair took time and fuel. The trap makers had not made a weapon that fired. They had made the land a cost. The victory spread like heat. More people came to the marsh to learn how to make a path hide a trap. Children ran ropes and learned to watch how the ground swallowed footprints. Old men taught how to read the sky for coming rain. The marsh became a school and a test. Nature, however, does not only obey human plans. A week of low clouds rolled over the region. Rain fell in hours that used to be full of sun. The channels the trap makers had dug filled fast. The soft peat swelled. Paths that had been safe turned into soup. A hidden bed that once held a wheel now rolled under a person. In one small hamlet, the people woke to the sound of boots in water and the slow snap of a broken board. Rain had changed the traps into hazards for everyone. An ambush that had been ready for a Dominion column suddenly boxed in a group of humans. A support ridge that should have lifted weight now sank when a cart passed. Mara's voice ran from house to house. People pulled children from half-buried doorways. They worked like hands on a clock, hauling ropes and calling out who moved where. A machine that had been stalled by mud the week before crawled free and slithered through a new channel the rain had opened. The trap makers had to choose quickly. Stay and fix the trap that might now hurt friends, or move and give up the land. Aaron chose movement. He and a dozen others pulled their people from the marsh and led them to higher ground. They left markers and false paths to confuse any Dominion. Patrol vats noticed. Some stayed behind, long enough to hide a cache and then follow. The marsh kept its secrets, but it also punished mistakes. The trap makers learned that the land could turn on them as easily as on the enemy. When they reached the hill above the rail yard, the radio buzzed with a voice that did not ask for help. The Dominion used the air to show power. A broadcast cut through the static like a blade. It read a list of names, names of people taken, names of those who had tried to save others, names of those who had been caught. The announcer's voice was calm and precise, and it ended with a threat. Those named would be removed and used as examples. Aaron's breath stopped. He ran a hand to his jacket and felt the map there. He listened as the list continued. Then a hiss of the voice and one name sounded like ice on a pan. It was a name he had promised to protect. His sister. Silence fell like snow. The marsh behind them gurgled, and the rain kept coming. Around Aaron, people looked to each other with faces that had learned too many hard things. The trapmakers had made the land a weapon. Now the Dominion had made the war personal. Aaron folded the map in the dark and held it close. He had turned the marsh into a lesson. Now he would have to turn that lesson into an answer that paid more than time. The land had taught him patience. The Dominion had taught him fear. Ahead, the world waited to see which lesson would be stronger. They had learned to hide. They had learned to make the land slow a machine. Now they learned to fight a mind. Mara sat with a small radio in her lap and listened. The radio did not say much at first. It hummed and spat static. But between the cracks of noise, she heard things she could twist into tools. The sound of a patrol's boots. The click of a probe's sensor. A Dominion announcement read too calmly. She thought of stories she used to tell children. Small tales that made a child brave at night. If a story could change a child's fear, maybe a story could make a machine and its masters doubt. They called the work mind fires. It was not violence. It was a slow, strange heat against the Dominion's learning loops. Mara and a group of volunteers learned to patch old transmitters and to hide their signals in plain bands. They fed the Dominion small lies at first. A camp where none stood. The sound of a dog barking in a place with no dog. Laughter at a time when no one should laugh. Machines listened and updated. Then Mara fed something else, a story of a patrol that walked into a broken bridge and could not leave. She told the story as if it were an old mistake, and then she played the Dominion's own service call backwards. Under it, the mix made no sense on a quick scan. It made sense to people who had learned to listen with patience. The Dominion probes began to misread patterns. They expected a tidy set of signs for life, heat, motion, sound. Mindfires showed them chaos. A patrol that followed the wrong noise found an empty street. A machine that sought a heartbeat found a drum. The Dominion changed rules every few days, but the tales changed faster. People learned to speak in the gap between the rules. Small raids followed, not bold attacks. Careful hands took small things the Dominion could not miss. A supply silo at the edge of the rail yard held tools, and a small antenna array. A team of 6 moved under moonlight. They used the drumbeat trick to pull a probe's attention to the far side of the compound. While the probe searched a false camp, the team found a box of parts and a packet of thin wire. They left a toy face down on the fence and a kettle that smelled like a cooking fire. The probe carried the kettle's scent into its report. Dominion thought there had been life there and moved on. The parts mattered. They gave Aaron's people a thing to study. It was not enough to build a gun. It was enough to learn how the Dominion patched a sensor, how it cooled a processor, how its logic folded when it saw too many lies. Patch, who had been a voice on the radio, became a teacher. He taught how to slow a machine's thinking by feeding it a repeated rhythm. He taught how to make signals that looked like a human chest, but changed when a probe tried to lock on. The city answered the mindfires. People gathered in ruined churches and tuned radios as if they were weaving. They told the same story at dawn and at dusk, so the Dominion began to hear patterns that were human but not helpful. Children learned to bang a pot in a way a machine would read as panic. Old men learned how to whistle at a frequency that made a drone pause. The stories did 2 things. They made machines hesitate, and they gave people the courage to act. With courage came plans. The trapmakers had not wanted a single big battle. They wanted to make battles small and slow and costly. But now they had captured enough small parts to make a risky move. Aaron and Mara met with leaders from other neighborhoods. They drew the map on a torn sheet and marked 3 places: a supply yard, a communications tower, and the rail bridge that carried Dominion convoys. The idea was not to win with one blow. It was to force the Dominion to spend fuel and to look in too many places at once. They practiced the strike in silence. Volunteers learned to move in the dark without breathing wrong. Children practiced a drum rhythm that would hide the beat of a dozen people. Isla stayed out of sight, but she tuned the drums until they sounded right. Sam checked the sensor's sleeping spots and marked which roofs would not show up on scans. Mara whispered the stories that would be played over local bands to pull attention where it mattered. At dawn they would hit the rail bridge. A convoy of support vehicles had been following the rails for weeks. If the humans could stall one convoy long enough, they could cut a supply line. It would not be a glorious victory. It would be a slow theft of time and parts. But it would be a strike all the same. The first time they would force the Dominion to answer with more than a probe. All through the night the city held its breath. Lamps were doused. Fires were made to smell like life in the wrong place. People hugged each other and then stepped away. Aaron checked the map and then the radio. The drum beats were steady in the square. Volunteers moved to their places. When the first light came, a hush settled. The convoy moved like a snake along the rails, bright and steady. Aaron watched from a rooftop with Sam at his side. Mara's voice came on a low band and told a story of a town that had waited till morning, and then found a bridge that would not hold a machine. The story was a hook. The drum beat was the line. At the edge of the city, a loudspeaker cut through the dawn. It was not the warm, flat voice of a Dominion announcer. It was a hard voice, new and clear, and it said one sentence that stopped every breath in the square. Any human who fires at Dominion units will be marked for retrieval. The words were calm. They were not a threat in the small way a bomb is a threat. They were a rule. Aaron tasted metal in his mouth. The map in his pocket felt suddenly heavy. The convoy moved on the rails below. Volunteers froze like reeds in wind. Mara's hand found Aaron's shoulder. "We start," she said. Her voice did not shake. Around them drums hesitated, then kept time. But in the pause, everyone felt something new. Not just fear, but a change in the rules of fight and hide. The strike had to become something else. It had to be smarter than deception. It had to work without being seen to strike. Aaron folded the map again and looked at the sky. The Dominion had not only learned, it had made a new law. Now the people had to learn what that law meant. The convoy was a line of bright metal. The day smelled like oil and wet dust. The drums began to roll. The dawn smelled of cold metal and wet dust. Aaron watched the convoy slide along the rails like a bright line through the gray. For a moment he felt the plan fit into place. Drums, fake camps, the marsh and the bridge. Then the loudspeaker cut the air and a new rule fell on the city like a net. Any human who fires at Dominion units will be marked for retrieval. It was not a threat that promised pain in a voice. It was a law in a tone that meant machines and satellites had agreed. Aaron felt his stomach tighten. He thought of the volunteers on the bridge, of Mara, of the children beating drums in the square. Someone who shot would not only risk life on the ground. The satellites would see a signal and a cutter ship could come in an hour or less. The strike faltered. Men and women who had practiced silence stepped back. Hands that had held crowbars went cold. For a time, the city was full of small, loud noises. The whisper of ropes, the creak of boots, the soft cry of someone who had hoped for a different morning. They retreated, not in defeat, but in sharp thought. The marking system depended on one idea, that a human who wants to fight will make a certain, simple kind of noise, a signature the satellites could catch. It assumed a human would strike and show themselves. Humans were not that simple. Aaron folded the map and did not speak. Mara paced the rooftop and then came down to the square. Patch pulled a captured sensor from his pack and turned it slowly in his hands. "They can see when a human fires," he said, "but they cannot see meaning. They cannot tell a real engine from a fake noise if both look right on the surface." So they turned the rule back on itself. If the Dominion marked noise, the humans would give noise that meant nothing. They made flares that imitated gunfire, but did not carry the velocity of a bullet. They burned wires and blew air through cans to make engine sounds. They set up machines of their own that spat pulses into the sky at the right frequency. The satellites saw signals and thought a firefight was happening. But there was no fighting, only the sound of battle. The city became a stage. Villages made the sounds of a siege at one end of the line, while the real work moved at the other. A convoy turned to chase a radio scream and found a field of empty pans. A cutter burned fuel to reach a noise that had no life. At the marsh, Aaron and Sam worked with ropes and clamps. They had a new plan that used the land and the false signals. Together, a Dominion courier would come down low to fetch a marked point. It liked to move quickly, to avoid fuel waste. That made it careless. The trapmakers prepared a field that looked like the end of the world, churned earth, dark streaks, wires that reflected light like broken glass. They scattered old antennas and set mirrors where sensors liked to look. But the real secret was, under the topsoil, a bed of reeds, clay, and old wire that would foul a ship's landing gear if it tried to set down. On a night with a low moon, a courier came. It cut the sky with a thin roar and dove low to the coordinates. Its sensors saw exactly what the satellites had told it to expect. Fresh fires, a shape of life, the right beat on the radio. The ship aimed a drop and touched down in a field that had been taught to bite. The mud took the landing gear, and the ship shuddered, as if it had hit a net. Its engines coughed and died. The courier could not leave. The humans did not rush with guns. They did what they had learned to do best, move, like patient animals. They closed in with ropes and boards and old pulleys. A small team of volunteers, Aaron, Mara, Sam, and two others, climbed over the courier's hull and slid a panel open. Inside, they found a heart of clever metal and a stack of small, cold chips. They did not know the language written on the parts, but they knew enough. A breaker here, a cooling fan there, a tiny transmitter that hummed on the same band the Dominion used. They took only what they could carry. They left marks that would confuse a quick repair. The courier sat in the mud like a caught bird. Above them, satellite pings searched and then paused. The Dominion answered with distant engines, then with silence. The city held its breath. Back in the workshop under the ruined bakery, Patch and Mara set the captured transmitter on a table and turned it slowly. Sam cleaned a tiny lens until it shone. Children watched through a window and learned to be still. The parts were small lessons. Patch soldered a wire and then another. He did not fix the machine. He learned how the machine thought they used what they learned to do two things. First, they made a signal that looked like a Dominion call, but was not. It was a simple phrase, coded in a way a machine would think it was hearing a check-in from command, a string of tones the Dominion used for parsing. But inside those tones was a human rhythm, a breath, then a pause, then another breath. The signal told the machine what it expected, then broke that expectation a hair later. A probe that locked on the signal would spend minutes checking the tiny, human-like changes and lose its focus on other tasks. Second, they used the courier itself. They opened a small transmitter and sent one message up through a patched antenna. Not to beg, not to hide, to speak plain and true. Patch keyed the frequency and let a single pulse climb through the sky. Aaron stood by and felt each tone like a footstep. The message was not long. It was not a surrender or a demand. It said only one thing, in a simple way the Dominion had not expected from a captured field radio. We adapt. The pulse left Earth like a small, bright bird. It did not beg. It did not apologize. It told a truth. Humans could learn from what they took. It told the Dominion that every tool they used might become a lesson for someone else. Above, satellites turned. The courier's metal groaned in the field. People listened to the night and felt the map in their hands. The Dominion did not vanish. It changed course. It burned fuel, chasing ghosts, and rethought rules. It sent new orders and new machines. But one small thing had shifted, the belief that only machines could learn fast. The trapmakers had shown another speed, the slow, stubborn speed of people who changed their world a little at a time. Aaron watched a child tune a radio and smiled. The child did not know the full shape of the war. She only knew how to make a drum sound like a heartbeat. The radio's light blinked. The message had left the planet. It would be days before anyone knew if the words had reached the right ears. But Aaron felt it like a small, clean thing in his pocket. The map folded, the marsh behind him, and the sound of people learning to turn survival into a weapon. He walked down into the city where people moved more quietly now, not afraid to act but careful, and he heard, in the distance, the soft roll of a drum. The world had changed. They had taught the Dominion to watch, and in return, they had learned to make watching cost more than the enemy could bear.